Hi, Mary. How are you?
Hi, I'm well, thank you. Lovely to speak with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking at this screening. Um, so just to give the audience a bit of context about who you are and what you're doing. So you're a Freudian film scholar, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And you've basically written extensively and given lectures on psychoanalysis in film, particularly uh, Freudian psychoanalysis. And you also have your projections lecture series at the Freud Museum, which is all really fascinating. If people are interested, they can check that out online. And you have a Patreon, is that?
Yes, that's right. I produce exclusive content on Patreon. It's mostly in podcast format, but I also upload recordings of lectures I've done before and loads of dialogues with people from the world of psychoanalysis, but also filmmakers too.
Amazing. You can follow Mary's Patreon at just patreon.com/ Mary Wild. And she's also on Instagram at PsychStar. So yeah, welcome to obviously this is the second Violet Hour screening, and the viewers tonight will have just seen four short films which you've also watched that center around the theme of dreams and the unconscious. So obviously this is your area of expertise. So all of the films in this program evoke dreams through their experimentation with form. I wanted to know, in your opinion, what do you think defines a dreamlike film?
Yes. A dreamlike film is one that doesn't seek to explain itself. I think of it as one that suspends logic and embraces contradiction and permits rupture. It's like we feel it before we understand it, if we ever understood it at all. And for me, what defines a dreamlike film is its disregard for linear time, narrative coherence, and psychological consistency. Instead, these experimental films, and particularly the ones that you programmed, appear to operate through association, displacement, and condensation, which are the same mechanisms that Freud describes in his dream work theory. So they resist fixed meaning and demand that we engage with them on a visceral, unconscious level. And their truth is not rational, but affective, the kind that seeps in, lingers, and disturbs. So what survives in the dream is sort of what's been, I guess, undergone some sort of transformation, like a psychic transformation. So it all sort of comes to the surface and we recall it. It seems to make no sense, but it has a latent meaning. And when I watch these experimental films, they have a latent meaning too. Especially I found watching them all together as you shared them with me. It produced a really interesting collective effect also on me, which they seem to be somehow like connected to each other.
Thank you. That's a really kind of beautiful summation of what a dreamlike film is. And I agree with the this idea separating sort of rational logic and understanding from the more intuitive understanding that's expressed in these films. And I also agree about the collective aspect of it. They do all sort of
Yeah.
draw on each other in a weird way. So that's yeah, really, really interesting that you picked up on that as well. So the subject of dreams has always been central to psychoanalysis, and both Freud and Jung wrote extensively on the idea of dreams being a kind of key to understanding the unconscious. So I wanted to know, why do you think cinema, and in particular experimental film, lends itself so well to the language of dreams?
Well, because cinema, like dreaming, is inherently hallucinatory. So a light flickers in the dark and we surrender to the illusion. Experimental cinema is perhaps the purest form of this because it forgoes the illusion of reality altogether and instead commits to form as a psychic process. There's no need for plot or character when the goal is not to represent, but to evoke. And psychoanalysis teaches us that dreams are not stories, they're structures of desire, trauma, and fantasy. So when cinema lets go of narrative, it becomes a perfect analog for the unconscious. I would take that a step further and say that the unconscious is structured like cinema, you know? So it particularly with experimental cinema, it's something that is, it's a modality that is completely doing away with any pretense of logic and linear narrative and the notion of reality. So now we're really operating as like the most pure form of unconscious material really at our disposal that we can capture in media because none of the usual rules apply. So the creator, the filmmaker is completely free to engage in the most authentic way with their unconscious.
Yeah, and I think you touched upon this idea of both cinema, experimental cinema, and the unconscious being sort of selective in the data that they present, and but it's not done it's not done in a conscious way. Um, I have made an experimental film before, and you can't rationally explain why you chose to put that symbol there or make it that color. It's all but it's a selection process. So I think that's yeah, an interesting point.
Yeah, because ultimately, the thing that makes it to the final cut, whether it's the final cut of your film or whether it's the final cut of the dream, what should have survived in our conscious mind from the dream, what we remember, what in a way what gets featured, right? Like what gets featured in a film, what gets featured in the dream, but also what gets featured in language, little slips, those little slippages that come out of nowhere and they're very surprising and they seem to fly in the face of logic in language. Those are very precious things because they have all survived the internal warfare of the unconscious, which is always to, our conscious personality, the ego, is constantly capitulating to the demands of the superego, which is obviously, our conscience, what we've internalized from authority, from the law, from expectations of our employers, our family, people who have a sort of authority in our lives, even the cops, whatever it may be. We've internalized these things. And so we have a little cop in our own head who's constantly pushing down and suppressing unconscious content. And the ego works in compliance with the superego. They're in cahoots. The ego is just like the public face of the superego. It's like the PR manager of the psyche, or even the HR manager, really. Um, and it's constantly repressing. So most of it is going to be repressed. What little fragments slip up and come to the surface, rise to the surface, those slippages are very precious in psychoanalysis because they're little signposts about authentic activity taking place very much in the underbelly, in the underworld of the psyche, which is the unconscious. So, in a way, I mean, I'm not a filmmaker myself, but I have a great deal of respect and admiration for, yourself and other filmmakers who commit to that project of capturing on film, especially in the modality of experimental cinema, those slippages, because you are committed to um, really producing, having a platform, creating a platform and a space for articulating specifically those very things that have been deemed unacceptable.
Mm. Yeah, I love this idea of the superego as being the HR manager or the PR manager of everything else. So yeah, thank you for that. Um, So when I was curating this program, it was actually only in hindsight that I noticed that all of the films center on images of houses or the home as primary locations. And this reminded me of Freud's idea of the uncanny, which, as you know, comes from the German word unheimlich, which translates literally to unhomely. I was wondering if you could speak about the links between domestic space and the uncanny.
Yes, the uncanny is often housed in the familiar. Freud's notion of the unheimlich as that which is simultaneously known and unknown is hauntingly apt when applied to the domestic sphere. A house is meant to offer safety, enclosure, containment. But when desire, repression, and trauma enter the picture, the home becomes a psychic labyrinth. Staircases lead nowhere, doors open onto memory. The domestic becomes a mise en scène of repression, a haunted space where the return of the repressed stages itself. So in these films, houses are not just locations, they are dream structures shaped by what cannot be spoken in daylight. And also just the very fact that we are shown objects, especially like in Meshes of the Afternoon, we are shown these familiar objects, and yet they don't they don't produce the normal associations that we would have with the objects. They're treated in an uncanny way. So it is a kind of reminder that the process of signification, language itself, which is supposed to be the house for meaning, a safe, familiar space for understanding and coexisting with ourselves and other people. It's a reminder that actually all of this is a house of cards. Freud had this great phrase, which is, a favorite of mine, where he said, the ego is not master of its own house. So ultimately, it's going to be a blow to the ego to understand that there's so much going on, and David Lynch liked to talk in this way. Like, if you recall, he was always with his hand like this, there's so much going on in our psyche, like this kind of thing. Very endearing, but he was right. He was absolutely right. And he, of course, used transcendental meditation to access a lot of these images that were deep in his psyche. And there's other techniques to do the same thing. But ultimately, I think for most of us who have been conditioned to believe that we are masters of our own psyche, when troubling material will inevitably arise from the inner depths and show itself, it does feel uncanny and frightening because we're suddenly reminded that we are not fully in control. There's something else, inside of us that is doing a lot of the steering, and that can be a radical shift in consciousness and can feel frightening. But ultimately, what it will do is produce an uncanny effect, which these films are really good um, at featuring. And really centering, that the uncanniness. And what's great about experimental cinema is that because it commits itself to the project of engaging with the uncanny, it is making it less overwhelming and integrating it more into conscious life, thereby making it much more functional. It's much more creatively enriching, and it's much more functional, and it's in a way liberating because it's saying, hey, like, you don't have to be constantly in control. You can also adapt to the flow of things, which actually is a form of liberation, I think. It's not so, we don't always have to be like this, at the steering wheel. We can kind of relinquish a little bit and observe in a curious way.
I completely agree, and what you've just said is so much of what actually just as a film club, Violet Hour is focused on doing. It's exploring the dark side of the screen. It's basically exploring the unconscious of cinema. And something I love about David Lynch, actually, you reminded me, is in interviews when people would ask him to elaborate.
Why elaborate on that if you don't mind?
No, I won't.
Because it's not a lot of it is non-verbal, it's even pre-verbal.
Sure.
Another thing that I noticed about all of these films is that they feature female protagonists and a fragmented sense of self within those characters. And I've noticed that this theme recurs across so many dream-centered films. Why do you think women are portrayed as the subjects of films exploring such a universal experience as dreaming?
This is a great question. And I think it's because the female subject in patriarchal culture has long been the site of projection for both erotic and terrifying content. Um, Cinema inherits this tendency, often casting women as the unknowable terrain upon which fantasies play out. But in dream-centered films, particularly in experimental and surrealist traditions, this can become subversive. So the woman becomes not object, but the dreamer herself. Her fragmentation then speaks not just to her victimization, but to the deeper structural instability of subjectivity. So women in these films embody this split subject, desiring and desired, seen and seer, trapped in mirrors, but also capable of shattering them. And these roles speak to universal psychic truths, but they are inscribed differently on female bodies, often through the double burden of fantasy and erasure. And another thing also is that I think that female subjectivity is maybe a more adaptable and malleable linguistic structure that is more capable of expressing, a fragmented sense of self, because maybe traditionally women have been given more license to emote and express. And I recall even Lars von Trier, oftentimes his protagonists and the main characters of his films are women. And often they're going through a really hard time. And he was once asked why it was that he cast women in these roles. And I think the intent of that question was, a little bit concerned, as in, why are you making women suffer like that? Like, are you a misogynist? Are you a sadist against women? It was like that line of questioning. But he turned around and he said, no, I cast women in these roles because women have a greater license to express these complicated states more than men. And I'm living out my own complex feelings through these female heroines. I'm a man and I don't get a voice in that way, and women do. So that's why they have to be my subjects, because I'm ventriloquizing them. It's really my voice. He didn't say those exact words, but that was the sentiment that he expressed. And I think the beauty of experimental cinema is that it's able to take, the way that women have been objectified and subvert that and make women not objects, but real subjects, so it's exciting to see that.
Yeah, I mean that is a fascinating answer, and I think it's so easy to fall down the rabbit hole of thinking, well, these are just women being portrayed by men. If you think about yeah, Lars von Trier, Gaspar Noé, even Roman Polanski, and you start to think, oh, is this some kind of sadistic thing? But then you look at female filmmakers and they're doing it as well. I think Bell Hooks writes really interestingly on this idea of that is repressed in men and through socialization, and it's through things like cinema and art that more feminine spirit and that complexity is able to be expressed. So yeah, I thank you for that. Probably my weirdest question I have, but I just have to ask it. So there's a really interesting crossover between surreal and dreamlike films and certain kinds of children's media. Um, so I was thinking about how I personally got into experimental film, and I think it basically goes back to when I was watching Teletubbies as a kid. And there are these really, if you've seen it, there are these really strange self-contained vignettes that seem completely detached from the rest of the show. And there's one in particular where a shadow figure walks around a house just turning the lights on and off, and there's no dialogue or anything, it's just that. And was almost Lynchian. And despite being aimed at very different audiences, both of these genres, children's media and experimental film, seem to operate with very similar logics and formal structures. Why do you think these kinds of narrative choices appear in both forms, both genres?
This is a great question. And I love that you were, um, you know, conditioned, programmed into being an experimental artist yourself by watching Teletubbies. I think that's very sweet and endearing. Um, I think that I think that what's going on here is that both surreal, experimental, dreamlike films and children's media, particularly Teletubbies, are operating within a pre-verbal logic. Children's media often mirrors the structure of early psychic life. So the content usually revolves around repetition, sensory immersion, and dreamlike juxtapositions. So they haven't fully been inducted into the, very sort of straightforward, very strict laws of language yet. They're still operating pre-verbally. And these are the foundational elements of both infancy and the unconscious. Experimental cinema taps into that same nonlinear affective mode, inviting a form of regression, not as infantilization, but as a return to the primal scene of meaning making. So, looping, minimal speech, fragmented logic, these are not failures of storytelling, they're deconstructions of it. They offer a kind of radical openness where the viewer must supply meaning, just as a child interprets the world through play and repetition. And often, as with the uncanny Teletubbies moment you referenced, what was meant to soothe can suddenly tip into the eerie, reminding us that the line between innocence and horror is thinner than we would like to admit. I just hope that the current generation growing up now will also have these little magical shows that um, evoke this wild imagination in their little minds, because I think it's very, very helpful to be exposed to that.
I just wonder, I hope, similar to you, I hope that that's been retained. I think it's so important to activate that part of the imagination.
Yes.
And yeah, we're quite short on time, so I'm just gonna jump to my final question, which is if cinema is a collective dream space, how might viewers interpret these films through their own unconscious experiences, or even use them to reflect on their own dreams?
I think to enter a dream space is to risk transformation. And these films don't simply ask us to observe, they ask us to recognize ourselves in their distortions. In the absence of clear meaning, we are forced to project, to feel, to remember. And a particular image might call up a forgotten scene, a buried desire, an echo of loss. And that's the work, not just interpretation, but emotional reckoning. So viewers can use these films as mirrors for their inner world, not to decode them like puzzles, but to let them stir what is unresolved within themselves. In this way, cinema becomes not a diversion, but a practice of psychic integration, a place where the fractured self can be seen, even if only fleetingly, in the flicker of another's dream. And I always like to say that, watching a movie is like a psychoanalytic act in itself. And what's important is not even what necessarily what like a really famous film critic has deemed, is important about a film. It's not, we shouldn't really be necessarily always seeking out the opinions of the so-called authoritative voices, but rather, I think it's much more interesting to sit with those subjective meanings that come up for the self and treat the film as a projective test. So these films are great little projective tests. They're like little Rorschach and inkblot tests.
Mm. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary, for answering these questions and for giving such valuable insights on this intersection between experimental cinema and dreams.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's so exciting to see the work you're doing with Violet Hour.
Thank you.